No more airbrushing, please.
This is Phil.
Hi.
He's one of my oldest friends and a pretty smart fella.
Smiley face.
Well, most of the time. But when presented with something as huge in scope as the Warhammer 40,000 hobby for the first time, it can be difficult to know where to start.
Smacking colours at a model and hope that they stick.
In this series, I'll be taking him from green as grass recruit to fully fledged battle commander by helping him build and paint his first models and then play his first games of Warhammer 40,000. Welcome to Hobby Bootcamp, episode 2. But before we get into that, let me tell you a little bit about War Factor. This week I was contacted by Adam over at War Factor as they're running a crowdfunding campaign for their second generation base adapters. He even sent me over some cool custom base rims for some of the characters in my Blood Angels to face off against Phil's Tau. These are easy to paint and there's different font options available for whatever your narrative gaming needs. If you're just like me and you've already named all the characters in your army anyway, War Factor provides a really cool way for you to get those on the tabletop. Check out the link in the description below for the GameFound campaign for War Factor. Chief Librarian Malatesta compels you. Anyway, back to the video. This week, we moved on from building to the second kind of pillar of the hobby, which is painting.
I thought putting together the model was going to be difficult, painting much harder.
We decided on a colour scheme for your Tau as well.
Yeah.
Tell the good people what you did and why this was the worst decision that you've ever made.
I decided to paint my models orange. I regret it.
Yeah. F's in the chat for Philip.
Yeah.
To be perfectly honest, without really knowing it, you're not going to have any kind of concept that certain paints will be harder to put on a model than others.
Absolutely not. I thought orange looked cool.
I'd recommend do yourself a favour and prime with a light colour. There's lots of different ways you can do this. We did a couple, starting off with a Rattle can, of Wraithbone spray, which is what most people are going to go into their local games workshop and pick up. How did you find priming with the Rattle can?
Easy peasy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just I kept trying to get it really close to the model and then realised that was not the way you're meant to prime a model.
So applying with the Rattle can, make sure you keep your can a decent distance away and give it plenty of shaking time before you get started. This is going to make sure that all of the propellant and the paint is well mixed together, and by applying from further away, you give a misting effect over the model, keep it moving, and you'll get a nice even layer of paint. You can also prime through an airbrush. If you've got any hobby friends who already have been in for a little while, they may have one. And so you can use that to get your models primed a bit more consistently. And it's particularly useful in the winter because something that I didn't really mention is rattle cans can sometimes apply a bit grainy when you do it in very cold or very damp weather. When you're using an airbrush, you need to make sure that the same steps apply. Keep it nice and far away from the model. You're looking to mist over and turn the model regularly to make sure you're not blocking off any details with excess paint.
Well, we started with a dry palette.
Yep, just a dry palette. So how most beginners are going to start out, taking some paint and just trying to apply it straight to a model.
We then switched over to a wet palette, and that was game-changing. A lot more fun, a lot easier to get sort of an even spread of paint, an even coat of paint on the model.
So I'd highly recommend for anyone getting into any kind of serious painting, your first couple of models will probably just be with whatever paints you have to hand. But as soon as you start trying to expand out what you're painting, a wet palette is a really worthwhile investment. And my first wet palettes that I was quite happy with, and I started doing my first passable paint jobs, was just a Tupperware with a piece of kitchen roll and then baking parchment. Can't remember where this one came from. It's now well and truly decimated with paint. But it's effectively plastic shell, some sort of thing that contains water, and then some kind of sheet over the top that will allow you to keep your paint moist. Even with a light base coat, when you're applying over the top with a paintbrush, you do still need to make sure that you're applying multiple thin layers. How did you find that process, Phil?
Challenging, I'd say. I think my go-to is always using a paintbrush that's far too small.
If you're using a tiny little thin brush, you're going to end up putting little scratchy bits of paint all over everything, and you're going to be able to see the brush strokes a lot more clearly, particularly when you're using something like an orange. I'd always recommend using a bigger paintbrush than you think, particularly when you're applying your first couple of base layers. Now, we also looked at priming base coats through the airbrush. Now, this was a bit of a double-edged sword.
Yeah, the airbrush was so much quicker than trying to just base coat the whole model with orange manually. Ollie had to kind of go over them again just to make sure the orange was evenly applied because mine looked like a terrible fake tan at some point. I do know that they're quite expensive and they can be quite a big investment to start off with. But if you're looking to get into the hobby seriously and you don't know anyone with an airbrush, I do think it definitely is worth it. It makes your life so much easier.
Now, because you have to also have a compressor with them, this bad boy here, the price does stack up. You can use rattle cans, grab a rattle can, get your base coats on, and you're most of the way there.
Yeah, I think the most difficult thing about picking up painting as a complete beginner is gauging how much paint you should put on your paintbrush and how thick the paint should be.
Yeah.
I think that's something I struggled with throughout most of the paint job because I have no reference point for what the right texture for paint is or the right amount of paint is. So it was nice to have Ollie next to me just basically saying, oh, that's much too runny or that's much too thick. We've got much too much paint on your brush. And as a result, I think I gradually developed a feeling for it a lot more quickly. By the end of the models, I felt quite confident that I was painting it right.
It's one of those skills, the brush control, that's something that you're always working on as a painter. It's something I still struggle with sometimes with certain paints. And whenever you get a new paint, you're always like, what's the consistency of this? How do I mix it? How does it go on the model? We had an example of this when we were using some silver paints.
Yeah.
The infamous Vallejo gunmetal.
Vallejo, please. Sponsor.
I actually have two versions of this paint. One of them is Gunmetal Grey, which is the unthinned version, and then there is the airbrush version, Vallejo Air Gunmetal. I gave Phil the choice of both. How did you find kind of being able to use those two same shade paints, or same tone paints, but in different kind of consistencies?
I thought the pre-thinned one was much more difficult to apply. It sort of ran everywhere and kept splodging on parts of the mod I didn't want it on. Whereas the Vallejo Gunmetal, the original one, was much easier to use. I decided to hold a paintbrush like I'd hold a pen because that's how you're raised to do it.
Yeah, and that's the general
Yeah.
advice given by art teachers and things like that, is hold it like you would a pencil. However, we're dealing with much, much smaller things here than what we'd normally do in our primary school art books. So the key is...
hold it much, much closer to the tip of the paintbrush.
Yep.
And that actually improved when I was trying to get little details onto the armor panels and everything. Made it much, much easier to get the little colours where I wanted them to be and not actually covering most of the area.
One of the other unsung heroes in the beginner painter's arsenal is just a cloth to wipe off any mistakes. Now, there's a couple of uses for this. Number one, you can use it to wick off any excess paint on your brush. You can also use it in an emergency situation to help avoid disaster on your paint job as well.
Yeah, one of the models had a lot of little holes in one of the sides, and I'd sort of managed to splash lots of paint into it, and it was kind of just pooling in all the little recesses. And so we emergency clothed all the paint out. So just having that little cloth to hand to quickly dab everything off. And yeah, even when you've put a little bit too much paint on the model, you can sort of slam the emergency brakes on your paint job.
We decided that we were going to get these Tau Fire Warriors up to battle ready standard.
It means having 3 separate colours on your model.
3 different colours on your model.
I just think painting up your armies, even if it's to a basic standard, kind of adds to the immersion. I remember when we played Blood Bowl, and once we painted our Blood Bowl models and they'd all had these like individual colour schemes and traits, it made the whole game much more enjoyable. As a beginner, painting up your models even to a basic standard is quite fun because more often than not, most of the model looks a bit wonky, but then you see certain parts that you painted well, and you can take pride from those little bits that look quite nice.
I think a lot of people underestimate the kind of meditative and the kind of cathartic nature of taking a model from a grey plastic sprue to built to painted to based to being able to play with it. That's probably what this is all about. It's about encouraging beginners to not be afraid.
Just have a little bit of fun.
Yeah, have a bit of fun, get some paint on your models and get playing, which is what we're going to be covering in next week's video. Well, if you have enjoyed this episode, you know where the subscribe button is underneath here. Leave me a comment down below and leave a comment for Phil as he continues on. Give him some tactical advice for his upcoming battle against my blood angels.
Please.
In the meantime, my name has been Ollie.
Mine's been Phil.
This has been my hobby. And we'll see you next time. We are getting so good at that.